Hey there! I'm still working on my sci-fi stealth game, so I'm gonna keep telling you about it. On the last devlog, I made this jury-rigged death trap out of scrap material that the player will have to build in order to chop down their opposition in Homefront. So now in this devlog, I'll go over the systems that allow the player to build it on their own, from making scavengeable materials, arranging an inventory and crafting menu, and the placement and construction of the trap. Alright, let's get crafting. First things first, hope you brought a jacket. You can't have a dystopian future without terrible weather. I've played around with triplanar shader nonsense, and I've got something that's just mwah. Faces near the top of an object have little splashes forming on top, and faces along the sides have raindrops trickling down. A bit of particles here, an ambient track there, and it's feeling pretty moist out there. Rain aside, if we're gonna make this death trap, we're gonna need some stuff to build it from, and a place to get that stuff from, and a place to hold our stuff. It's gonna get messy. Since we first need to pick something up, let's start with interactable entities. Over here are some temporary interactables, both given a shimmery shader to catch the player's attention. In Homefront, the devices you create all come from an assortment of scrap and garbage laying around the city. Scattered around each level will be small rubble piles from which you can scavenge for usable parts. Not only do we need a way to interact with these piles, but with other entities as well, like buttons, doors, or mission objectives. The closest game object on the interactable layer within reach of the player is set as our current interactable. Rather than having multiple scripts for each unique interaction, I've made a base interactable script that these interaction types can inherit from. Since the interaction type is predefined, the current interactable is just told from player input to do the objects command based on its interaction type. When the player has an interactable object nearby, the player should be prompted that they can actually do something with it. I've set up a small UI panel to enable and hover over the nearest interactable while tracking camera movement. The camera zoom influence I mentioned in the first devlog plays a part in scaling up the prompt on closer angles. While next to something interactable, holding F will gradually fill up this interaction meter. The fill amount can be any custom duration, and I can include any amount of checkpoints in the meter where the fill amount won't fall below. This will be useful for returning to scrap piles that hadn't been completely exhausted of resources. Now we need these scrap piles to give us the scrap we're scavenging, so now it's time for an inventory system. I had minor experience with this before from an earlier prototype of mine. It was a fantasy top-down shooter I called Project Shard Hunters. You can check it out on my itch page, link in description. Thing is, the inventory worked, but it was fairly basic since there were only 2 slots to deal with. Also, the only item in that game was a cookie. Well, and a half cookie. Anyways, I did manage to cobble together a bigger scale inventory system. Pressing tab activates a panel for your inventory. I've added a third transform to my camera influence system, used for a closer and adjusted angle for when you're examining your inventory. Now we gotta fill this thing up with our goodies, but how do we define our goodies? Bada bing, item class. It's a scriptable object that holds a bit of item defining data for us. Next, we set up a smaller panel for a space in the inventory to hold our item. Make a bunch of them, put them in their seats before the bell, cause those panels all got a class called item slot. It holds on to what item exists in its space and the item's quantity. At the top we've got the master inventory. This controls changes to what items we're holding and checks for good slot readjustment. When we search in our pile of scrap, each searching checkpoint adds an item to your inventory. Now we can hold things. Let's take what we're holding and turn it into our murder machine. I gave the inventory a tab menu system to hop over to a trap list panel. There's slots for our many traps and a field to display information about our selected trap. All that held information can be found in another type of scriptable object that I call its blueprint. The blueprint holds the trap's prefabs as well as the description and details. These slots get filled based on what traps the player has learned, and these data blocks fill in based on whatever blueprint is selected. With a valid trap to build selected, we can click build, and now we need to figure out exactly where it's gonna build. We have a separate prefab in the trap's blueprint for when the player enters trap placement mode. I give the constructed trap's mesh a hologram shader, throw in some scan lines and vertex displacement, and have it follow the cursor while in placement mode. The hologram's color will change to indicate whether or not the trap can be built in its space. The Q and E camera turning now rotates the trap instead when in placement mode. If it's a valid placement and we click, I gotta say, it's pretty fun telepathically summoning death traps wherever you want. The frame rate disagrees. The player can now freely place traps. but honestly, I think some assembly is required. On a successful click in placement mode, this cues the player character to walk to the build location. I went back into the sign traps animation and put together a sequence where the traps components are attaching together. We start the building sequence, and once it's done, it swaps out the building prefab for the finished prefab. There you have it! We can head to our scrap piles, scavenge out some suitable pieces, pop open our pack, plan and place our death trap, and watch it spring to life, poised to take away somebody else's. I've got a lot of traps and gadgets planned, so I'm glad this framework is getting dealt with early. So, in the next devlog, well, I don't know. The devlogs are finally caught up with the project. I'll have something out when I got cool stuff to show ya. Catch you on the next one, and as always, take it easy out there.